Welcome back to Network Africa. For the first time in the world's history, less than 10% of the entire world's population will live in extreme poverty. And this good news was shared by the World Bank today. The World Bank President Jim Yong Kim said the downward trend is due to strong growth rates in developing countries and investments in education, health and social safety nets. He, however, warned that continuing the progress could be difficult, especially in a period of slower global growth, volatile financial markets, conflicts, high youth unemployment, and the growing impact of climate change. Well, as we rejoice over this news, Sub-Saharan Africa is projected to have about half of the world's extreme poor by that time. And then the report also says that they are concerned, well, the authors are saying that they are concerned that poverty is falling too slowly in Sub-Saharan Africa. Dr. Babatunde Omilola, the head of development and planning at the United Nations Development Program, joins us now from New York. Thank you so much for making out time to speak to us on Network Africa.
Thank you for having me.
Well, great news, you would say, but still, half of that figure, half of that 10% will be in Sub-Saharan Africa. How do you respond to this?
In fact, the world has made significant progress in global poverty reduction. And most of this global progress has been what happened in East Asia and Pacific, particularly in China. In China alone, since 1980, more than 680 million people were taken out of poverty. But in the case of Africa, I think Africa has also done well. When you look at poverty figures for Africa, in 1981, 78% of Africans, particularly those in Sub-Saharan Africa, were living below the poverty line. But in 1990, that figure reduced to 52.5% of Africans. And what the projections are telling us is that by the end of 2015, 35.2% of Africans will be living below the new poverty line, which is $1.90 a day. There has been remarkable progress, but of course there are a lot of challenges. One of the biggest challenges is because the growth process in Africa has not been inclusive enough. The growth process has not been able to take so many people out of poverty because the growth is occurring in few sectors, particularly in the extractive industry, and also because of the volatile commodity prices that we have been witnessing in many African countries. And that's why majority of extremely poor people in the world will still be in Africa by the end of this year.
So let me ask you and take you back to last week during the General Assembly. The United Nations recently announced its aim to end extreme poverty by 2030. In fact, it is one of the 17 global goals unveiled at the UN last week. Are there new approaches to this goal? Because, of course, when we use the old style to get the new results, it probably won't happen. Are you seeking or looking at approaching these problems using new methods?
Thank you for that question, and particularly for talking about the General Assembly that took place at the UN last week. What you should know is that eradication of extreme poverty is at the core of the newly adopted Sustainable Development Goals. And for knowing that, we should also know that eradication of extreme poverty in all its forms and dimensions, we will not only be focusing on income poverty. So the new approach is not only to focus on income poverty the way you are looking at it, but to also look at poverty from other dimensions in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of opportunities, and also in terms of access to resources and natural resources by people from all over the world. That is the way we'll be looking at poverty going forward. And one of the biggest challenges that we have in terms of reducing poverty or eradicating poverty, the way we know it now, is because for a very long period of time, most people focus on income poverty. Income poverty will not do justice to poverty because there are some people that might actually be poor in terms of income, but they might be rich in other dimensions. And we want to look at all of this holistically. So looking at poverty, we want to look at nutrition, we want to look at agriculture, we want to look at different sectors, particularly where people that are poor are employed in different parts of the world, especially in Africa. And we also want to do what we call South-South cooperation and South-South learning. We want to see what other countries have done in other parts of the world, especially in East Asia and also in the Pacific, in terms of how they have been able to reduce poverty. What you should know is that without what has happened in East Asia and Pacific, we will not be talking about global poverty reduction today, especially what has happened in China. In China alone, 680 million people were taken out of poverty within 30 years, within 3 decades. So for Africa, We want to look at how to make growth inclusive and sustainable in order to be able to reduce poverty. And we want to also make sure that sectors that are employing most of Africa's population are growing and are growing quickly.
So to round this up now that you have touched on using income poverty, like the World Bank uses that that measure to say, okay, to define poverty in places like sub-Saharan Africa, and you've already said that you're looking other ways of qualifying that. To sum it up now, how do we move away from here? We have a deadline of 2030. How do we go from here and move to, where we're trying to get in terms of alleviating poverty and reducing that 5% that has been forecast about Africa to say 1% or 2%?
It is doable. We can end poverty by 2030 in the world and also in Africa. What we need to do is we have to do this holistically. We have to combine different elements together. First, we have to focus on nutrition. We have to also focus on agriculture because most people in Africa still depend on agriculture for their survival. And until we invest in that particular sector, we'll not be able to lift them out of poverty completely. We also have to deal with sustainable management of natural resources. We have to deal with the adverse effect of climate change, but we have to do it holistically and all hands must be on deck. This will not be what only the government has to do in many countries, but also the private sector has to be involved. In fact, the private sector would have to serve as the engine of growth in order to reduce poverty. Let me also say that the global poverty reduction that we have witnessed, it's largely due to growth. 75% of global poverty reduction is due to growth in many countries. And 25% of global poverty reduction is due to policies in social areas such as health, education, and social safety nets. So for us to really do it in Africa, we have to make sure that we invest heavily where the poor people dwell and also in sectors where a lot of poor people depend upon.
Thank you so much, Dr. Babatunde Omilola, the Head of Development and Planning at the United Nations Development Program, speaking to us right there from New York. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
The South African Parole Board is set to decide whether or not to allow the Paralympian athlete Oscar Pistorius to leave prison early on Monday. Correctional Services spokesperson Manelsi Wilela confirmed the hearing will go ahead as scheduled. The Parole Board met in Durban in September, but postponed the hearing for 2 weeks. Oscar Pistorius was initially expected to be released on August the 21st to serve the rest of his sentence under house arrest, but 2 days before that, Justice Minister Michael Masutha announced Pistorius would not be released, saying the Parole Board had acted prematurely when it decided in June that he could be released in August. At the time, the Justice Department said it did not get a chance to complete Pistorius' case due to having several matters to review. The Paralympian was jailed last year after he was found guilty of culpable homicide for gunning down his girlfriend Riva Steenkamp at his Pretoria home on Valentine's Day in 2013. Pistorius alleged to have mistaken her for an intruder. Pistorius has spent almost a year behind bars. Ivory Coast officials are not happy with cocoa farmers in the country because the farmers have reportedly destroyed 99% of the nation's 34,000-hectare park in Mont Peko. Well, the national park also has thousands of leafless Iroko and Samba trees tower over a sea of lush plantations like headstones. They say this is a testament to the heavy environmental cost of Ivory Coast farmers invading that national park. Well, it has paid lots and lots of a huge amount of price for that devastation. Mont Peko has an illegal population of around 28,000, which will approve the first test of the government's new policy. Evictions are slated for December, and similar operations will follow in Ivory Coast's more than 200 parks and reserves. Though no firm statistics exist, analysts say much of the illegal farming occur in protected forests, and shutting those illegal plantations would lead to a fall in output, at least in the short term. An overnight curfew in Guinea's second city of Nzerekore has been imposed after a fight broke out on Saturday, leaving one dead. More than 80 people were also wounded in the fighting. On Saturday, a campaign visit from President Alpha Conde, who is running for re-election, led to a riot between rival parties, even as backers of the president clashed with supporters of his rival, Selu Delaine Diallo, in the hotly contested city. Opposition parties have called for Sunday's election to be postponed over alleged irregularities in the process. President Conde is facing 7 challenges in the second election since the death of the long-serving leader, Lassane Conte. Coming up on Network Africa. Kenyan teachers call off a 5-week strike as court assures settlement of unpaid salaries.